Senators, I rise today to speak to Senator Bernard's motion as presented to us by Senator Lankin to establish a special committee to study anti-Black and anti-Indigenous systemic racism in Canada. Systemic racism is pervasive in this country. I have listened with concern as so many of our colleagues have relayed their experiences with racism over the past several days and week. For example, Senator Moody's portrayal of life as a Black person in Canada. Senator Omidvar's account of double standards right here in the Senate. Senator Anderson's account of living as an Indigenous Canadian and raising Indigenous children in a world where racism is a daily lived experience. I appreciate the advice of the Cree elders that Senator Laboucaine Benson shared with us last week, that anger, if properly directed, is a great gift. I thank my colleagues for sharing their experiences and perspectives with the Chamber. While this is a difficult topic, I am grateful for the opportunity to listen and to continue to expand my understanding of how racism manifests itself through our society. So what can or should those of us from non-racialized backgrounds do to fight systemic racism? Last week, our colleague Senator Brian Francis said publicly, and I quote, "Indigenous, Black, and other racialized people cannot be expected to continually do the emotional labor of educating the wider public on the impact of systemic racism." He went on to point out that non-racialized people must identify our privilege and the benefits that we have accrued at the expense of others. We must also do the work. I take that as a call to action for all of us and for all Canadians of goodwill. I've spent my entire career in the research business, and research will play a vital role as we go forward. I note, especially over the past few weeks, expressions of opinion from some people wondering if systemic racism even exists, or what does it mean? And expressions coming from those both with privilege as well as from members of the general public. Let me begin by putting some data, some facts to the phenomenon of racism to add to the perspectives that we have heard. According to the 2016 census, for example, Black Canadians earn significantly less than non-racialized Canadians, regardless how long their families have been in Canada. First-generation Black Canadians earn about $13,000 less annually than immigrants who are not members of visible minorities, and third-generation Black Canadians still earn $16,000 less than third-generation non-visible minorities. Black Canadians are nearly twice as likely as non-visible minorities to experience low incomes and to have higher unemployment levels. These are just some examples of what systemic racism looks like in Canada, but these dynamics take root far before people enter the workforce. I was particularly struck by the results of a StatsCan General Social Survey conducted in 2016, which found that fully 94% of Black Canadian youth between the ages of 18 to 25 aspired to obtain a university degree. But only 60% thought that they would actually achieve this. In comparison, 82% of all other youth aspired to a university education, and almost all of them, 79%, felt they would achieve it. Senators, research is often impersonal and detached, yet this finding speaks to me in particular about how racism can snuff out and block and stifle the aspirations of many motivated young people, just as Senator Moody so poignantly described in the Chamber last week. Here are some other research findings that speak to systemic racism. 3 years ago, my former colleagues at the Environics Institute launched the Black Experience Project in collaboration with Toronto community organizations to identify issues in Toronto's Black community, which is Canada's largest Black community. Among their research findings from the large survey of the community are as follows. 2/3 of Toronto's Black residents reported experiencing unfair treatment because they are Black. Here are a few examples. 59% said that others expected their work to be inferior. 56% reported being treated rudely. 54% reported being observed or followed while in a public place. All because they are Black. That was the reason that they gave. Experiences with police services were just as bleak. Over half of Black Torontonians reported that they have been stopped in a public place by police, and among young men aged 25 to 44, the figure was 79%. And 38% of Black Torontonians had been harassed or treated rudely by police, and among young Black men, the figure was 60%. Another major national survey conducted for the Canadian Race Relations Foundation in 2019 found more of the same. Majorities of Black Canadians across the country, 54%, and over half, 53%, of Indigenous people have personally experienced discrimination due to their race or ethnicity from time to time or, in fact, regularly. Such experience is also shared and reported by significant numbers of South Asians, Chinese, and those of other racialized group. And the COVID crisis has only served to increase the discrimination toward Canadians of Chinese background. A survey conducted by the Angus Reid Institute last week and reported yesterday in the media found that half of respondents of Chinese background have been called names or insulted, and 43% report being threatened or intimidated for reasons associated with the pandemic. These kinds of research findings and others speak clearly to the existence of racism in this country. Now, after quoting to you all these research findings, you might want to reach the conclusion that there is plenty of race-based data to answer all the questions we might have about racism in this country. But unfortunately, this is not the case. In their detailed recommendations on actions to be taken to fight racism, the Black Parliamentarians Caucus identified serious data gaps and called on the federal government to immediately lead in the collection and stewardship of disaggregated data, race-based data on police intervention and public sector employment, and the racialization of poverty. To quote the Black Parliamentarians Caucus, with respect to those missing numbers, and I quote, "It is hard to change what one cannot measure." I support their calls to action. The collection of disaggregated data in many more areas of society is an important step toward developing inclusive social and economic policies. Now, I want to say that there is actually some good news on this front. Statistics Canada has beefed up its collection of race-based data considerably, with more changes to come. The census, of course, has collected disaggregated race data for many years, as have the annual general social surveys and other surveys conducted by StatsCan. An upcoming GSS will look at social identities and discrimination with disaggregated data, and a new division of Stats Canada called the Centre for Gender, Diversity and Inclusion Statistics will be a hub for intersectional analysis. It is vital that we collect data on gender, disabilities, ethnic origins, immigrant status, language, and socioeconomic measures to understand how racism intersects with other statuses. And beginning this summer, the mighty monthly labor force survey, in fact, is going to add race-based measures after 75 years to all the measures of wages and labor force activity and all of the other statuses that are already collected in the labor force survey. So I would say that Stats Canada is definitely working on this area, but they still have more work to do. They still have to collect and they still have to disaggregate more of their data. So that might be some of the good news. But now the not so good news. The COVID crisis in particular has exposed a serious lack of race-based data in public health. And we have heard the call for more of this data so frequently over these past 3 months. Much of this missing data, which is the so-called admin data, is the responsibility of the provinces. Most, but not all. Most of the provinces have been very reluctant to collect this data for whatever reasons they may have. And this reluctance carries over into other areas, into education, social services, and policing data. This continued laissez-faire attitude with these sectors is to the detriment of all of us. We must work to change the situation, and I believe that the special committee especially will help keep up the pressure, as we have seen over the past few months, putting pressure on these organizations and the provinces and others to collect the data has actually resulted in some promises on their part to do so. So we actually learned that we have to keep up the pressure. Otherwise, it's going to go away. They won't make the changes. And therefore, this committee is going to be very helpful for us to keep up the pressure in this area and others. So, colleagues, in conclusion, I support the motion introduced by Senator Lankin on behalf of Senator Bernard to establish a special committee on systemic anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism in Canada. This committee, I believe, is the best way to tackle the many issues, not just issues related to data, but many others that have been identified by Black parliamentarians in their statement on anti-Black racism and identified as well by our colleagues here in the chamber. I look forward to studying the work of the special committee as it moves toward action to end systemic racism in its many forms in this country. Thank you very much.